Uh, Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Glenn Deason. I'm a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. And with me today is Ivan Kachanovsky, a professor focusing on Ukrainian studies at the University of Ottawa. And you're Ukrainian, but also a citizen of Canada, as I understand. Anyways, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It is pleasure to join your podcast, which is again very interesting and very informative about conflict in Ukraine.
Oh, thank you. So, well, as you know, when COVID began, everyone seemingly became a virologist or an epidemiologist overnight. And same when Russia invaded Ukraine last year, everyone suddenly became a Ukrainian expert, going on TV, being presented as experts, even though having no background in the country. Again, everyone being certain about all the facts of Ukraine as they were certain about their own virtue. So it's good to have an actual expert, not only, of course, you're from Ukraine, but you're a professor specializing in Ukrainian studies and researching topics like democratization, political communication, conflicts, again, with focus on primarily Ukraine. And if I'm not mistaken, you would probably also the one academic who has been researching the killings on Maidan by the snipers to the greatest detail. At least this is when I started to follow a lot of your work, because you also have been tracking and following the legal proceedings in great details, also documenting a lot of this. I saw you publishing a lot of the videos as well from the trials. And during these legal proceedings, I would argue this is a very important part of your research, because the legal proceedings after the sniper killings, this was the origin of the war, which has been going on for 9 years now. Anyways, today we're going to cover a lot of this and explore the conflict which is going on in Ukraine. Again, going on since 2014, or some might say earlier, since 2004. But before we delve into this, I thought we could perhaps focus on the Maidan massacre as by these snipers. And again, the country will be overstated why it's very significant, because this also became the legitimacy for the West to support the coup in Kiev, which toppled President Yanukovych. And indeed, in the West, we claim it's not a coup, and when we claim this, we always cite the killings on Maidan as the reason for why it was not a coup. So the narrative is that, as everyone knows, President Yanukovych ordered the killings of protesters, but none of the Western media has actually shown any interest in the trials that actually followed. Even despite this being, what kicked off a 9-year-long war, it strikes me as strange. And from my own experience, whenever there's a big media blackout, it's usually because the media doesn't like what it sees. So again, it's a great privilege to have you. I would say the top scholar has been following the legal proceedings of these killings on Maidan. So I thought perhaps we could start there. If you can, perhaps explain what happened on Maidan and what you learned from following the trials that followed. And again, you've documented it very well in your work, and please don't shy away from any details. So I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I was researching Maidan massacre since it actually began. I was watching this live from Canada. It was very late at night during the Maidan massacre when it happened, and I was watching these events during the Maidan even before, when violence started on November 30th, 2013, after Maidan became a mass movement of protest against government of Yanukovych. And I specialized in researching conflicts and political violence in Ukraine since I wrote my doctoral dissertation in the United States under the direction of Simon Matti Lipset. And I wrote about conflicts and historical conflicts, historical violence, including World War II, Soviet Great Terror, UNUPA, mass murder by the UNUPA, organizations in Ukraine, in particular in Western Ukraine. I also wrote about war in Donbass, in annexation of Crimea, and I researched current war between Russia and Ukraine. So this is my main area of research. And Maidan massacre is also one of the main areas of research, because this is a crucial issue to understand origins of the conflicts in Ukraine, which followed after the Maidan massacre, which was used to overthrow the Yanukovych government, and led afterwards to kind of reaction by Russia, and specifically annexation of Crimea by Russia, which was pro-Russian region. And in addition to this, Russia also started to support separatists in Donbass, and another pro-Russian region of Ukraine, which also this conflict escalated also into civil war in Donbass, and now there is a war between Russia and Ukraine, which is, I think, very dangerous development, which I wanted to kind of also it was easy to prevent, but unfortunately now this conflict is going on, and I I think astonished about also representation of this war and how origins of this conflict are ignored basically by the media, mainstream media, and a lot of politicians, and even by a lot of experts who became overnight experts about conflict in Ukraine and have very little knowledge about what happened. So based on my analysis, which I analyzed all publicly available data about Maidan massacre, so I examined all the videos from different numerous sources which are publicly available, including actually videos. Some of the videos which I examined were from Norwegian television, a company I found in Norwegian television company website. I think what this called, I'm not sure its name, but K or something. This is main television network in Norway, and the videos were quite astonishing, because they show actually how protesters were shot also from direction of buildings which were controlled by Maidan forces and not by the government police. And these videos were not shown at the Maidan massacre trial. And the Maidan massacre trial, another area of my research, because it provided crucial evidence about Maidan massacre. And I was researching Maidan massacre trial since 2015 when they started. And just last October, the trial basically ended examination of all evidence. There was closing arguments, and afterwards there is now recess or basically break to reach decision by the jury and by the judges. So I think decision in this Maidan massacre trial will be issued very soon, and maybe within the next several months. And I think this is a very crucial issue. And another issue, it was just quite unbelievable to watch all this Maidan massacre trial proceedings on YouTube. They are televised. Basically, they are broadcast online, but they are never basically reported by the media, Ukrainian media or Western media, and this also includes Russian media. Basically, nobody reported about this Maidan massacre trial, even so this was a trial of the century in Ukraine, because of a very important issue which has tremendous consequences. And so I rely on the evidence from this trial to see actually what this evidence tell us about Maidan massacre, who was responsible for this mass murder in Ukraine on February 20th, 2014, which led afterwards to all these conflicts in Ukraine, which now also escalated into war between Russia and Ukraine after Russia illegally invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. And the evidence is just remarkable, and this is overwhelming evidence revealed by the Maidan massacre trial and investigation in Ukraine, which is not reported by the media. And this includes testimonies of Maidan protesters who were wounded. So these are people who were wounded during Maidan massacre. So they saw what happened. They have no reason to kind of testify against Maidan leaders, because they have opposite incentive, obviously, to implicate the Yanukovych government and his forces who were blamed for this massacre. But they testified at the Maidan massacre trial and investigation that they were shot from buildings which were controlled by the opposition, basically by Maidan opposition. at that time, and or that they saw snipers in these locations. They witnessed themselves, and this is not just few Maidan protesters. This is absolute majority of Maidan protesters who were wounded during Maidan massacre. So this is like kind of just unbelievable. I have video compilation of their testimonies with such revelations that they saw snipers in these buildings, that they were shot by snipers in these buildings which are controlled by Maidan opposition. And in particular, they name Hotel Ukraina, which was very large building which was located next to Maidan. And I stayed in this hotel many times when I visited Ukraine for doing my research and for just vacations, because this was very convenient, very nice located hotel in the downtown, in the very center of Ukraine. And this hotel actually was controlled by the Maidan opposition during the massacre. And people, when I presented this evidence that there were snipers located in these buildings, they deny basically that first they denied that there were any snipers located there. But when I presented testimonies and presented other evidence, they started to say that basically anybody can go there, and basically they said that anybody can be a sniper in this location because there was no control by anybody by Maidan opposition. And this is totally against all the evidence, because Svoboda party, which is far-right party of in Ukraine, before the Maidan massacre, few weeks before Maidan massacre, they issued official statement on their website saying that they took control over this hotel, and they say they're going to start to guard these hotels. And this is not just statement. There are videos of Svoboda leaders, deputies from the parliament, standing guard basically at the entrance of hotel, and not allowing anybody else to enter, with exception of Maidan snipers and with exception of foreign journalists. So they would basically not allow even Maidan protesters who wanted to capture snipers located, who were shooting Maidan protesters from Hotel Ukraina. So Svoboda leaders and other guards who were linked to Svoboda, they prevented Maidan protesters going to upper floors of the hotel and trying to capture snipers or shoot snipers and so on. And this is, again, this is supported by videos. There are videos like BBC video shows this. You have also French television video showing this kind of entrance. You have other videos which show that this hotel was guarded at the time of Maidan massacre by Maidan opposition, in particular from Svoboda party. And there are statements also by head of Maidan self-defense unit in Hotel Ukraina, who said that they guarded this hotel since January of 2014. And there is also statement from a security statement from a hotel staff, one of the managers of Hotel Ukraina, who said that this hotel was guarded by Maidan forces, and there was no any Berkut snipers or any government snipers in this hotel. So this is just supported by all this evidence, which that this hotel was guarded by Maidan forces, in particular from Svoboda, and the snipers were located in this hotel, Hotel Ukraina, at the time when Maidan protesters were shot. And I found videos of basically of such snipers in the Hotel Ukraina linked to far-right forces, and in particular shooting into the action of Maidan protesters. And there are testimonies, as I mentioned, of absolute majority of wounded Maidan protesters. And this is very interesting development. Again, just give you one example of this is for me like Orwellian, just watching this, because there was a famous video of Maidan massacre, most famous video of Maidan massacre, which was shown on all national television networks, basically on all major national television networks in the Western countries and in many other countries, which was used to show basically as evidence that Maidan protesters were killed and massacred by government snipers. And this video was just about 1 minute long video, which was filmed by Belgian television channel called VIT channel from the Hotel Ukraina. And at the Maidan massacre trial, they showed all this video, entire video, which was about 1 hour long, almost 1 hour long video, and the video was never shown by any television. I received this video from a Belgian journalist after it was shown at the Maidan massacre trial. I requested him, contacted him, and he provided me with such video for my research. So this is video which quite astonishing because it shows actually what happened. Well, what happened, and it shows evidence of Maidan snipers in the Hotel Ukraina shooting Maidan protesters. And this was never shown by any television networks, and I posted this on my website, academic website on YouTube. And this is a video which, for instance, there is a passage. You can see in this video that a group of Maidan protesters are led by 2 other protesters to the site of the massacre. For no reason, they are very loud. They are very insistent in trying to lead this group of Maidan protesters to the site of massacre, in front of basically of cameras of Western journalists and other journalists. And this Maidan protesters, a group of Maidan protesters, they look into Hotel Ukraina. They are very worried about going there, and one of them shoots very loud. Do not go there because I saw snipers in the Hotel Ukraina shooting all Maidan protesters. I saw gun flashes. So he says this loudly, and afterwards when they advance, this group tries to advance very slowly and very cautiously. There's a video, this same video, Belgian television video, which shows that this group of protesters very narrowly avoided being shot at from the Hotel Ukraina. A bullet impacts at tree near this group just by accident. So, and these Maidan protesters turn back towards Hotel Ukraina and say very loudly to the snipers, "Do not shoot at us. There are snipers shooting and so on. Do not shoot at us." So this basically means that they know the snipers were from their own Maidan forces, not any other government snipers. And afterwards, when the same protesters went further, they would be massacred basically. Many of them, this was a group of about 10 people, and several of them were killed, and almost everybody else was wounded. And they also testified at the Maidan massacre trial. They were shot from Hotel Ukraina and other buildings controlled by Maidan forces, or that they saw snipers there, and which was confirmed by this video, Belgian television video, but it's again never shown. Another example, again, a very astonishing example of video which was shown at the Maidan massacre trial. The same video, which I think was video which was shot by filmed by BBC, and BBC they showed a Maidan sniper shooting from the Hotel Ukraina into the direction of Maidan protesters, and also into BBC crew. And BBC and Maidan protesters ran away, and they shooting sniper basically after they are shot from this hotel. And the British journalist says that he saw the sniper located in Hotel Ukraina on this 11th floor, and this sniper was wearing a Maidan style helmet, green helmet. And this is again, this was reported by British television, by BBC, but what was not reported by any media, Western media, is that in this room, this was a room which was occupied at the time of Maidan massacre by one of the leaders of Svoboda party. So this sniper was located in the room which was occupied by one of the leaders of far-right party in Ukraine. And this was not just some kind of information which was made up or uncertain and so on. This was actually a Ukrainian official investigation. They revealed this information in 2015, 1 year after the massacre. They revealed that this room was occupied by Svoboda party leader at the time of the Maidan massacre. And this video, which shows them shooting from this room, and but again, what was not reported and what I shown in my study and in my video appendixes, that Ukrainian television network called ICTV, major television network, they filmed the same room they filmed snipers in the same room, and they said during Maidan massacre, and they said that these snipers were shooting Maidan protesters in the back. So this is like evidence that they were shot in the back from the same room, which was occupied by deputy from the far right party. And this is not, again, this is not yet end of the story. This was a testimony of one of the Maidan protesters who said that he saw gunshots from this window, the same window on the 11th floor of the Hotel Ukraina, and that Maidan protesters were falling at the same time. So this means that they were shot from the same window, which was of the hotel room, which was occupied by right Svoboda deputy, and there was even more striking revelation during the Maidan massacre trial, again never reported by any media, is that Maidan protester who was filmed by this BBC news television journalist from this video when the snipers were shooting from this window. He was filming this video, and he's easy to recognize, and he actually was filmed along with other protesters who came from Volhynia, Maidan Self-Defense Company from my native Volhynia region in western Ukraine. And he testified during Maidan massacre trial that after he and other protesters ran away from because they noticed the sniper shooting into Maidan protesters, and BBC crew, and he specifically mentioned that he was recognized himself in this video. He said that other Maidan protesters told him that this sniper was our sniper. And he said that afterwards, when he was looking into windows in the Hotel Ukraina, he saw in another room on I think 6th or another floor of Hotel Ukraina, there was another sniper who with a rifle who made who showed to other Maidan protesters not to make any fuss about this, basically not to stop shooting about snipers. They're basically just giving signs to Maidan protesters to basically not to reveal the location of the snipers in the Hotel Ukraina, which again demonstrates that this were not government snipers. This was actually from Maidan forces, because afterwards nothing happened. There was no investigation about this Svoboda leader room, any connections, and government investigation denied that there were any snipers located in the Hotel Ukraina. Even so, there are videos of them shooting from the Hotel Ukraina. There are videos of them during the massacre, including with hunting weapons and with Kalashnikov type of weapons. But there are admissions by Maidan snipers, including from Georgia, that they shot Maidan protesters from Hotel Ukraina and other locations which are controlled by Maidan protesters. So this is just one example of one.
But this is the snipers confessing, or
yes, this were like snipers from Georgia who admitted that they were members of sniper groups during Maidan massacre. They said that they were working for Maidan opposition. They were given orders by Maidan leaders to massacre both police and protesters. And they said that they were based in Hotel Ukraina, along with other locations. So and they admitted this publicly in Italian television program, a documentary which was shown on one of the main Italian television networks. In this documentary, later they also admitted this in Macedonian television interviews, in Israeli documentary, and later in the American documentary, which was shown also on US television, one of the minor networks. And this is like testimonies. And again, there are no investigations, nothing. Basically, all the media and all such experts basically claim that their testimonies were kind of made up, that they were not real snipers, because even not real people, because they are basically actors who were hired to make such testimony, made up testimony. And again, this story became very widely publicized by so-called fact checkers websites as evidence that basically they are not real people, they are just made up, the story is made up and so on. They were never in Ukraine, and even Ukrainian government investigation claims that they were never in Ukraine, that they basically just kind of hired to say something, people who are actors and working for Russia or something. Again, without any evidence, or just using some inconsistencies like some spelling mistakes or some video kind of inconsistencies and so on. And what was not reported actually by any media is that one of the self-admitted snipers, from Georgia, he testified at the Maidan massacre trial in a video. And this evidence was admitted by the trial. And so they basically, and he testified along with two other Georgian, again, self-admitted snipers. He testified for Ukrainian Prosecutor General Office via video testimony, which was given in Belarus before the Russian invasion of Ukraine on request of Ukrainian Prosecutor General Office investigating a massacre of police, which took place at the same time on the Maidan. And so his testimony, video testimony, was admitted at the trial, and Ukrainian prosecution actually presented documents saying basically that he was in Ukraine shortly before the Maidan massacre. So there is evidence that he crossed the border into Ukraine, and shortly before Maidan massacre, before Maidan took place, and he left Ukraine afterwards. And he basically and other self-admitted snipers claimed or stated that they actually they entered Ukraine under false ID, under false documents, without crossing Ukrainian security or border control. They basically said that during Maidan massacre they were kind of let to pass border control without any surrendering their documents or their actual passport or fake passports which they used with fake names, and they revealed all these names. But again, there was no investigation. Nobody actually examined this. They claim that this is evidence because they do not have any border crossing confirmation during Maidan massacre that they were not in Ukraine. Even so, they said that they were they crossed the border illegally. Basically, they were led by Maidan leaders, not through official channel, but without any document check. And this is again, nobody even cares. Nobody even takes this in consideration. And evidence of this, actually, one that he was in Ukraine is confirmed. And but a German public television, what is main television program of ARD, so-called fact-checking program, they claim that he was in prison in Georgia at the same time, so he could not be in Ukraine. Even so, Ukrainian investigation confirmed his testimony in Italian television documentary and in Macedonian television documentary, and for the Maidan massacre trial and investigation, that he was in Ukraine shortly before Maidan massacre. And he said that he was, again, very important testimony, because he said that he came to Ukraine before Maidan, even before Maidan, specifically to locate positions for snipers. And he said that they selected Hotel Ukraina and other buildings on Maidan as potential locations for snipers, because he was sniper in Georgian army. So this is again, testimony which was totally suppressed and totally denied. When he made this testimony in television documentaries, and now testimony basically was admitted as evidence at the Maidan massacre trial, and he testified, and there is confirmation that he was actually in Ukraine before this, which is a very important evidence. But there is nothing, no media reports, no reaction, and this is just another example, quite astonishing example of what was happening and how this massacre is misrepresented. Just give you another illustration. There is a famous documentary, Winter on Fire, which was nominated for Oscar.
Oliver Stone, is it?
No, this is a different one.
Sorry. Oh, by the way, I'll just have to interrupt 1 second. As Alexander mercouris has joined us. Unfortunately, was some delays, so sorry for the interruption. Sorry for the interruption, Professor Kachanovsky. You're muted, Alexander. Sorry.
Anyway, I am indeed muted. Professor Kachanovsky, I owe you a great apology. Great apologies for my late joining, but I'm very delighted to be here as well.
Yes, thank you.
So we haven't gone on for too long. The professor's only been discussing primarily the.
I understood. I followed very well, and of course, I'm very familiar with Professor Kachanovsky's work.
And it's quite fascinating because, again, from the trials that followed, which so there hasn't been much coverage of it all, there's a majority of the witnesses say that the shootings comes from the positions held by the Maidan movement, and again, the testimonies corroborate this. The videos showing the shooting shows this. The professor was just talking about the admission by the snipers, which set up firing positions. But there was another. I read one of your articles where there was a reference to Svoboda, which is one of the more nationalist parties in Ukraine, where they have referred to conversations with what was it, Westerners or Western governments who had explained that what was it that they would not intervene unless there were killings or unless there were like 100 dead protesters. There wouldn't be much they would be able to do in terms of for forcing down the government, something along those lines.
Yes, exactly. This was quite again another example of astonishing revelation, which was never reported by any major Western media, which is quite unbelievable, because these are two leaders of far-right Svoboda party in Ukraine. And one of them was also leader of Maidan, one of the leaders of Maidan protest during Maidan. And another one from this far-right Svoboda leaders was deputy head of Ukrainian parliament. So he was very important in this vote to remove or impeach Yanukovych, which took place after Maidan massacre, because Yanukovych was blamed by Maidan for Maidan massacre, and they used specifically this to impeach Yanukovych without any investigation, without any evidence. And he was the one who was presiding over this kind of session of the Maidan parliament, which was very crucial. Sorry, before this session, he presided not this session, but he was presiding over previous session, which right after the Maidan massacre, which blame which blame Yanukovych and his government forces for this massacre. And he and this leader of Svoboda party, they said in their separate interviews, which were published by two Ukrainian journalists in a book about Maidan. And in Ukraine, and these journalists are pro-Maidan journalists, and they interviewed basically various Maidan leaders about Maidan events, different Maidan events, and these two leaders of Svoboda party said in their separate interviews that a few weeks before the Maidan massacre, they met with a Western representative. They did not name this representative, but they said that they met with this representative and they had discussion when Western policy would change towards Yanukovych government, because they said already there were few protesters killed, and they said when Western, but there was no reaction from the West. They asked when there would be change in the policy, and they had basically, they said there was basically like negotiations or or some kind of discussions with this Western representative. How many people would need to be killed in order for Western policy to change and to end basically recognition of the Yanukovych government? And they said, we discussed like 5 people. Said Western representative said not enough, like 20, not enough, 20 is not enough. So they ended with 100. So they said this in their interviews. They basically decided before massacre that 100 people killed. The victims would be a number which would lead to change of Western policy towards Ukraine and towards recognition of Yanukovych government. And this is exactly what happened. After the Maidan massacre, there was immediately declaration by Maidan opposition about heavenly 100. So they said the Maidan protesters were heavenly 100. Even so, the number of killed Maidan protesters was less than 100. But they included people who died in other places in Ukraine, who died from health related issues before Maidan massacre or in these areas. They also included even one of administrators from a party of region office in this who was killed by Maidan protesters, basically. So they created this kind of reference to Heavenly 100, basically, which would mean 100 protesters killed. And immediately afterwards, Western policy changed. The Western governments, including the US government, Biden administration, immediately blamed Yanukovych for this massacre. And in his memoirs, Biden said that he called Yanukovych right after the Maidan massacre and told Yanukovych that he have to leave not only his position as president of Ukraine, but also he have to leave Ukraine because he would be basically blamed he blamed Yanukovych for the Maidan massacre. And the European Union did the same, even so there was agreement signed by Yanukovych and leaders of opposition and leaders of European Union countries like from France, Germany, and Poland to have a peaceful transition in which you have early presidential elections, in which there would be coalition government and investigation of the Maidan massacre would take place, and there would be withdrawal of forces from the downtown of Kyiv, but also disarmament of Maidan protesters. But this is never implemented. There was no investigation taking place under auspices of Council of Europe, as was written in this agreement. There was afterwards Yanukovych was blamed for this massacre, and this was used to overthrow him using this vote in the parliament. Even so, this vote was again not under any consistent. It was not based on any constitutional provision. It was illegal under Ukrainian constitution because it did not. There was no reason under Ukrainian constitution to impeach Yanukovych, and again, it did not follow any procedure which was specified in the constitution and Ukrainian laws, and it also lacked a constitutional majority which was required by this to impeach Yanukovych. But what was also not mentioned by this, again, by any basically major media in the West, is that Yanukovych fled not because he was responsible for Maidan massacre, as they claim, but because there were assassination attempts against him. And this was revealed by other trials which took place. Yanukovych was initially not even charged with Maidan massacre. Only later, a few years ago, he was charged with the Maidan massacre. But before this, he was a witness. He actually testified as a witness as a Maidan massacre trial. And he also said that this was basically, he blamed Maidan opposition, but he did not reveal any specific evidence in support of his statements. But I think very important that during this Maidan, actually during other trial, when he was charged with state treason for basically providing letter to Russia to intervene in Crimea, which was used by the Ukrainian Prosecutor General Office to charge Yanukovych with state treason. And during this trial, there was various evidence by witnesses and by people from, for instance, helicopter pilots who flew Yanukovych after Maidan massacre. They testified that there were assassination attempts against him. There were several assassination attempts. For instance, his motorcade was shot at, and bodyguard was almost wounded. He was likely hit and he was able to. His bullet hit one of his guns, and so he basically miraculously survived. And this was motorcade of Yanukovych. And another assassination plan was taking place in Kharkiv, where Yanukovych flew from Kyiv after Maidan massacre, and afterwards there was another testimony that helicopter pilots told the judges at this trial that they received order from new head of Ukrainian government, temporary president of Ukraine, to basically shut down helicopter with Yanukovych if they would not land him again in one of the locations under order from a new government. And so they refused basically to do this, and they were able to kind of flew, and Yanukovych fled to Russia. But there are like testimonies again about these assassination attempts, and even not only by his former bodyguards who stayed in Ukraine and joined new government, or by helicopter pilots again who stayed in Ukraine and had no reason to kind of to testify in favor of Yanukovych. But there was also testimony by former president of Ukraine, first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, who again supported Maidan and has no reason to testify in favor of Yanukovych. He testified in this style that before the Maidan massacre, he received anonymous call from somebody who said who told him that there is a plan called Chershesku plan to basically assassinate Yanukovych, and this basically this was confirmed later by events which took place, assassination attempts. And this is very important because Ceausescu was removed and assassinated, basically executed after the similar kind of event which took place in Romania in 1989, when there were mysterious snipers who massacred a lot of protesters against Ceausescu communist government, and these snipers were basically blamed to be working for security services of Ceausescu government, but actually after investigation was not able to find any evidence to support this, and only in recent few years actually leaders of this of new government who overthrew Ceausescu, they were charged with this massacre, basically for using false flag kind of massacre, because they were the ones who basically created this kind of and ordered other units basically to shoot into their own protesters to create kind of position. And this is what happened with in Ukraine. So there is a very close similarity in this regard. But this again was never reported by major media, and a lot of people when they try to kind of to look into Ukraine, they have all this kind of image of Ukraine as very different from what I actually do, what I actually know based on my research, very long research about conflicts and violence in Ukraine, and specifically about Maidan massacre and other cases of violence. And this is just one example. There are many other examples as well.
I must say the whole narrative around when Yanukovych fled, it's quite interesting, because often we hear that the argument, well, it wasn't a coup because he fled, but yes, but why did you flee? If they're killing, he's about to be assassinated by the Maidan movement, then obviously fleeing that doesn't contradict coup. It supports the hypothesis of a coup, but there's also been these other arguments around it. I remember, I forgot who it was. Maybe it was British foreign minister, someone in the British government at least, said that this removal of Yanukovych was fully constitutional. But again, the Ukrainian constitution is very, it's black and white. You can read it, and they had to walk it back afterwards, saying, well, obviously it wasn't constitutional. They didn't follow any of the directions they had to. And then there's also the argument that it was, democratic revolution. I mean, people were standing up. But even the BBC, they had to cite polling, found that the protest did not have majority support. And that was the protest on Maidan. Even fewer would have supported the actual toppling of a president against the constitution. So, but again, the whole idea as well that this is the norm, that you have a popular uprising. So you have a few tens of thousands in Kiev, and they should overrule the democratically elected president, of 40 million people in the country. It's very strange. We wouldn't call that, democratic. When it happens in the US, we call it insurrection. If you have people flooding into the capital, it's not okay. Well, I guess this is a democratic uprising. They can topple the democratic government. It's very strange, but also, I guess the key component of removing Yanukovych obviously was the killings on Maidan. And actually, on that, I remember back when it happened, there was this leaked phone call. Again, I'm not sure if they walked it back afterwards, so I apologize for my ignorance. But at that time, there was I think 11-minute phone call, which was I guess hacked, I'm guessing, by the Russians and leaked, in which the EU foreign affairs chief at that time, which was Catherine Ashton, she was in a conversation with the Estonian foreign affairs minister, Urmas Paet, I think, and they were discussing that, the shootings don't appear to be from Berkut, the government special forces or police, but instead the snipers are on the side of the Maidan. They're the one killing the protesters. And they were, oh gosh, this is horrible. And what should we do about this? Again, I haven't followed this to the same depth as you, so I'm not sure. Did they walk it back afterwards, saying that they didn't mean it like this, or has that conversation moved forward at all, or has it just been ignored?
No, I think actually this Estonian foreign minister here confirmed that this was a real conversation. But there was a denial by the media afterwards. They said that this was false information, because they said that Olga Bohomolets, who was chief of Maidan Medics, basically denied that she provided such information to the Estonian foreign minister during his visit to Ukraine. But this is again, and this was taken at face value. Even so, Bogomolets herself testified and said in Ukrainian television interviews and media interviews that there was evidence of snipers in Hotel Ukraina, that she knew about this, and another Maidan doctor who actually headed Maidan unit of Maidan doctors during Maidan massacre, and later became Minister of Health of Ukraine. He said the same, basically. He said that the Maidan protesters were shot by the same weapons and using the same with the same signature, basically. This is also very crucial because forensic medical examination during Maidan massacre trial, again, which were never reported by the media or revealed that absolute majority of Maidan protesters, almost all protesters, were shot from a very steep direction. So they had wounds which were very steep, like a very big difference between entry wound and exit wound. So this means they were shot from buildings which exactly matches the locations in the buildings which are controlled by Maidan forces, like Hotel Ukraina and so on. And absolute majority of Maidan protesters were shot not from the front, from the actions which are horizontal actions by the police on the ground, Berkut police on the ground, on the same ground level, but they were shot from the back or from the side, left or right side. Again, from the areas which are controlled by Maidan forces, which I also identified in my original study of Maidan massacre, but this was never reported. In addition to this, again, forensic examination revealed that the bullets which were used to shoot Maidan protesters, they were from bullets which included bullets like hunting bullets, like pellets, which are used in hunting, or bullets from caliber which could not be used in any, which do not match caliber even of Kalashnikovs, which were used by Berkut police during the Maidan massacre. This caliber matches NATO caliber bullets, and two protesters were killed actually by bullets which were expanding bullets which are used in hunting, and one bullet which was killed Maidan protester, he was killed by this bullet which was had corrosion. So it was basically kind of basically damaged bullets which kind of hunting, which used in hunting and so on. And again, this was never reported by any media. And this is also quite astounding. And initial ballistic examinations conducted by government experts, forensic experts, using computers-based system which automatically matches bullets to bullet casings from sample of a database. They do not match any bullet started from bodies of Maidan protesters to bullets, any Kalashnikov, any bullet samples from Kalashnikovs of entire Berkut regiment in Ukraine. But this this was never reported by any media, but this was revealed by the Maidan massacre trial and so on. But that's why this is quite astonishing to see such evidence, which will be totally ignored and totally totally omitted. Even so, there are many other types of evidence which supported the same findings, the same conclusions.
Professor, can I just ask you to clarify that last point, because some of the evidence that you're bringing to our attention, which has not been reported in the West, is actual evidence that was reported at the trial itself, at the massacre trial. So it is evidence that has been presented to a court, maybe not a court that is administering, justice in quite the way that we would expect in some countries. But nonetheless, it's not just theories, it's evidence which was presented to the court itself. And some of this relates to testimony, which was also presented to the court itself. Or have I got this wrong?
Yes, exactly. And just to give you one example, my own video appendix from which I wrote for my studies, which presented major conferences in US, academic conferences in US and Canada and Sweden about Maidan massacre, and also which I published in a peer-reviewed article and as a book chapter. And now I have my actually article is omitted by another peer-reviewed journal, which will be shortly published, about Maidan massacre trial and revelation. So this video appendix with testimonies of 80 witnesses was admitted by the Maidan massacre trial and was shown as evidence at the Maidan massacre trial. I had no involvement in this trial. I have, again, I do not provide such evidence, but it was publicly available on my websites, academic websites like academia.edu or ResearchGate and other websites. And this was used by, again, as evidence by Maidan massacre trial. And this is just one example because they testified about, again, all the testimonies, more than 80 testimonies at the time were about Maidan snipers. And now I have the same video appendix with expanded to more than 100 video testimonies about Maidan snipers. And this is because this is quite unbelievable, because they still deny that even there was Maidan snipers. Even so, now there are more than 100 video testimonies after the Maidan massacre about such snipers. I also created another video appendix during the Maidan massacre. There are almost, I think, almost 100 other testimonies during Maidan massacre itself about snipers located in Maidan buildings like Hotel Ukraina and so on, or about Maidan snipers. Again, during Maidan massacre, including videos, which just video testimonies and videos of such snipers. In addition to this, there are like several hundred other witness testimonies in social media, in media published, including like mostly Ukrainian media testimonies about snipers in Maidan control locations and buildings. But again, still people and official investigations, they still deny. They never investigated such snipers. This is quite unprecedented to see so many forms of evidence which support kind of the same findings that there were snipers in Hotel Ukraina and other Maidan control buildings. They massacred Maidan protesters. This is totally ignored and denied. Even so, all the evidence is publicly available. And just another example, they used a New York architecture company to create a model of Maidan massacre, of killing of 3 Maidan protesters. And this model was published by New York Times and presented as evidence, definite evidence that these protesters were killed not by Maidan snipers, but by police in front of them, using a kind of model of the Maidan massacre and shooting of these protesters. But again, just for me, this is just astonishing to see how this massacre can be misrepresented even by the media like the New York Times, and they do this openly because I wrote this to New York Times. I published this in my academic studies and published in the consortium news article showing that this was basically this model was total misrepresentation of evidence, which was actually publicly available on the website of this company called C2 Company, New York architecture company, because they switched location of wounds of Maidan protesters, which were again very steep, and from right to left side, which is much as location of Maidan control buildings, they switched this to make them almost horizontal, and they made them also from a front direction, even so this was from the side. And this is very clear because you have forensic examinations which are translated into English language in their own website, which give exact location like centimeters and so on. And there is a difference of, in one case, of 20 centimeters between exit and entry wound, another case 16 centimeters, and this. But they made this horizontal. So this is quite unbelievable, and this is consistent, which I also showed this in videos. There are testimonies of Maidan protesters who witnessed killing of these protesters, and he saw exactly that they were killed from this direction, from the hotel, from Bank Arkada, which was again controlled by Maidan forces, not by the Berkut police on the ground. There is also videos which show that shield bullet wounds, so bullet holes in this shield during the shooting of these protesters. They appear from the direction, from the side, and from the top direction, not from the direction of the Berkut police, which film, at the same time they film not shooting into the direction of Maidan protesters. And this is, again, another evidence which was never reported. And in addition, there is another protester, just give you briefly, who was killed, again, in this model, he was, they show this, that he was killed from the front, in his helmet, with anti-bullet in front and exiting in the back of his head. But there is a video of his helmet during the Maidan massacre, and there is only bullet hole in the back of his head. And forensic medical examination said that there was only wound in the back of his head when he faced police in front of him, and his sister testified in Maidan massacre trial that he saw only wound in the back of his head. So there is no wound in his helmet in a medical examination, and in any testimony that he was shot from the front, in front of his head. But New York Times and this model, they claim this is what happened. This is just unbelievable because all the evidence is kind of publicly available, but I was not able to publish this again. New York Times, and they still have this article as evidence that this was massacred by Berkut police and not by Maidan snipers. But
I'm curious. When there is when they are presented with the evidence you're referring to, I mean everything from everything from the testimonies, the bullet wounds, the kind of bullets they're using, the admission by snipers, the interviews by Saboda, like what is the counter argument to the evidence? If we're looking at both sides, is there a debate? Is there a counter argument? What are we looking at here? Because again, my ignorance is also partly because I don't see any debate. It's just it went in just a big memory hole. I haven't seen what the counter argument to this is. Well, so I'm genuinely asking what is the argument against this evidence which is put forth?
They have no real arguments, so they instead of arguments they attack me so they resort to ad hominem attacks, saying this is like I'm kind of politically motivated, I'm pro-Yanukovych or some kind of I'm pro-Russian or some all this stuff. Like this is just unbelievable, just because I have no connection to Yanukovych actually or to Russia at all. So kind of I'm a Ukrainian scholar doing research in Canada. So again. Politically, I supported European Union membership even during Maidan and before Maidan for Ukraine. So again, kind of I want Ukraine to be kind of like a Western democracy with freedom, liberal democracy, and so on. But kind of argument is basically to attack me and so on. And they use such arguments. Recently, there was an article published by journalist Katie Young. After I presented her with all my studies, with all evidence, so she basically omitted all testimonies. So she never reported testimonies of Maidan, wounded Maidan protesters who were shot and testify on Maidan snipers. So he claimed basically this is again conspiracy theory, and this is like because this is Kremlin argument, all this kind of stuff. And she cited, as in support of her argument, she cited this blog post by Ukrainian historian of Ukraine, David Malpas, who published this blog post in 2014, basically. Critical of my research because this was original paper and he's not an expert. He just published a blog on his own website and they use this blog basically as evidence that this is all my Maidan studies, including new study, and they do not mention the evidence that even David Malpas, after he published this original blog in 2014, after I presented my first draft of this conference of this paper. And now, which is much more kind of, which is after all this evidence became publicly available, he now changed his view and he said that he would have not written his blog post as the way that he wrote it before. Even so, he said in his original blog post that I provided evidence that there were snipers and so on. But kind of he now basically said that he now said that based on my research, he basically became convinced that this was basically his original claim that this massacre was done by government snipers is not longer supported by him. So he said that basically snipers are not identified, and he said that basically claims that there is need for a forensic ballistic experts to determine this. This was another argument, kind of to say, and this journalist Katie Young, she also uses, and some other critics, a lot of critics, they just do a search on the internet and they found the websites which are like about several dozen websites, almost kind of identical websites, which accuse me of being a falsifier of Maidan massacre and Ukrainian history and so on. And they cite this website as basically as evidence that my academic studies, which are published in peer-reviewed journals, top conferences, and so on, kind of my studies and so on. And this is they do not mention that this is actually websites are created by activists from far-right Svoboda Party, like who has no knowledge, kind of no expertise at all. He linked to far-right Svoboda Party. He's from the time when this party was the Nazi party in Ukraine, and he created such websites specifically kind of to attack me and so on, using all the false arguments. And he also did this for other scholars like Ukrainian historian kind of UNUPAR and other kind of people. For instance, he also does this on Wikipedia and so on. And he basically, for instance, he tries to justify Jewish pogrom of Jews in Nazi-occupied Lviv by OUN organization far-right organization of UN in 1941 by using so-called scientific anti-Semitism, and saying that basically Jews basically deserve kind of were massacred because they collaborated with the Soviet Union and so on. So this is a person who basically kind of openly is anti-Semitic and justifies all this mass murder by UNUPA and so on. And now they cite this person who has no knowledge, just published on his own kind of on his own website, like blogs, basically as evidence to dismiss my academic research. And this is quite unbelievable.
Which can I just say, not just academic, because I've had experience of working courts. I mean, my own view about your work, Professor Kachanovsky, is that it is certainly rigorous enough, and certainly methodically and carefully assembled enough to have been presented to a court. At the very least, a proper investigation looking at this evidence, considering the forensic evidence that you provided, the witness evidence especially, it is imperatively called for. And given the importance of this crisis to what has happened in Europe and in international relations, understanding how this crisis began, because of course it matters hugely whether this was a peaceful protest fired on by a government or whether in fact it was a violent protest leading to what was in effect the unconstitutional overthrow of a president. Your entire perspective of the whole Ukrainian crisis thereafter changes, whichever of these views you adopt. So when you have an assembly of the kind of evidence that you've put together, you would feel a need to establish the actual truth of what happened, not to engage in ad hominem attacks. Professor Kachanovsky, this is a question I wanted to ask because I completely agree. The media doesn't cover this story. It really doesn't want to look at your work, the media in the West. Governments in the West don't either. Do you think that this has led to us to where we are? Do you think, for example, it's encouraged perhaps a sense of impunity, a sense within Ukraine on every side that you can do anything because ultimately the truth no longer matters?
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons for a current danger situation, which will be devastating for Ukraine, because actually this Maidan massacre escalated into conflicts, which I already mentioned: civil war in Donbass, Russian military intervention in Donbass in support of separatists, Russian annexation of Crimea, and now this became escalated ultimately into war between Russia and Ukraine, when Russia illegally invaded Ukraine in August of 2014. And actually Putin used one of the arguments to justify invasion. He said that there was a fascist coup in Ukraine, and he specifically mentioned the Maidan massacre and other kind of events. And this is, again, according to my research, this far right was not done this on their own. So this was not fascist coup, but this was actually because there was involvement also of oligarchic parties like Fatherland and snipers from Georgia and possibly other countries. So this was also, there is also evidence of regime change, US-led regime change in the Maidan, which I also published kind of during this transition. Even so, there is no evidence of any direct US involvement or any other government involvement, but I think Western governments at least de facto supported this regime change and violent overthrow of the Yanukovych government, specifically to use Ukraine against Russia. And this is basically gave immunity and basically license kind of leaders of the Maidan opposition, and also specifically very importantly to far right, who also were very active in this Maidan massacre and overthrow of Yanukovych. They gave them license basically to on violence, so because they feel impunity and they are not persecuted in Ukraine. So Zelensky government also did not persecute them, and actually even after they threatened Zelensky with murder and so on, right sector leaders threatened him like an Azov, neo-Nazi Azov unit and so on, civilian wing of neo-Nazi Azov, and so on. So they basically feel impunity because they are not punished for anything, including the Maidan massacre, which actually led to massacre not only of police but also massacre of their own Maidan protesters. So this is again kind of, and this led afterwards there was Odessa massacre, which taken place of separatists, and now the violence also far-right was also very active in the start of civil war in Donbass. And so I think that now this is kind of became very dangerous escalation of this, which goes back to kind of lack of justice in the case of Maidan massacre. And specifically, it was easy to prevent this war if people who were behind the Maidan massacre and organizations, including far-right, would have been exposed and persecuted for such crimes, either by the Ukrainian courts or, for instance, by International Criminal Court, which had to examine this case, but they basically did not do anything in the case of investigating Maidan massacre. And this is why I think this will be very dangerous for Ukraine, because now future of Ukraine is very problematic in any case of outcome. Ukraine would suffer very significant damage because of this war.
I mean, it seems to me.
Oh, sorry, you go first.
No. I mean, it seems to me what has happened is that Ukraine has been hijacked. I mean, an armed group is a country that's, had just established itself. It was going through very, very severe growing pains. There were many, many problems, but it was evolving. It was developing. There were elections, and its history was hijacked, and hijacked by in a most violent means. And the violence that began with this and the cynicism that began with this, because, when you're shooting your own people in order to create a false flag, that is an exercise in extreme cynicism that has escalated and got completely out of control with the disaster that we now see. Now, I'm going to say something else, Professor Kaczynowski. When people deceive to this extent, how can you be certain that anything thereafter that you hear or read is true? I mean, the sense of cynicism I would have thought that there must be in Ukraine, because some people in Ukraine must sense the truth. The sense of cynicism must be enormous.
Yes, I think this is also, when I talk to Ukrainians, they privately they admit this. This is actually they are very skeptical about kind of my official Maidan narratives, that they believe my evidence and so on. But publicly in Ukraine, it's not possible to discuss this because government basically controls the media. And there was few exceptions. I gave interviews to Ukrainian media actually before including for my native Western Ukraine region of Volhynia, to television networks, to several television networks, to some newspapers and so on. So there was such possibility to discuss this. Even so, most media coverage in Ukraine and the West is dominated by all these narratives, fact-free narrative, which basically says that Yanukovych and his government forces massacred Maidan protesters. Even so, evidence is beyond any reasonable doubt says opposite. But this is again evidence never reported, and only they repeat this each time, and a lot of people just believe this or not question this or are afraid to discuss this because this is very dangerous to talk about this, which I mentioned already. I'm not sure if I did this during a recorded interview, that after I published my original study, presented my original study, my house and all my property, land and all my property, like personal property, they were taken away illegally by decision of local judges who were told to issue such decisions after phone calls from the top, instructions from the top. So this was obvious political interference and retaliation for my research. So they take away all my property, all my house and land. So this is just one example of basic impunity, and nobody cares. There is again nothing. Media would never report this, and this is done kind of even to again prevent any justice. Even so, my investigation, my original paper, which I presented in American Political Science Association annual meeting in San Francisco, was used by Ukrainian Prosecutor General Office. So they admitted that they used my paper with all the evidence there, but they did not do any investigation. They continue to deny that there were any snipers located in these buildings. Even so, official Ukrainian investigation first. They initially stated on just 1 year, almost 1 year, no, not 1 year ago, 9 years ago, in 2014, about 1.5 months after Maidan massacre, they stated officially that snipers were located in Hotel Ukraina, that the snipers were foreign snipers, including foreign snipers, and they shot Maidan protesters from Hotel Ukraina. But afterwards, they changed this in 1 day. They totally denied that this ever happened. So they started to blame police on the ground. Belgorod police, they are not snipers by any definition. So and afterwards, official Ukrainian investigation, they said that about almost half of wounded Maidan protesters were shot by snipers or by people who were located, by shooters who were located in areas which were not controlled by the government forces, which means like Maidan controlled areas and locations. And they do not charge anybody with their shooting. So nobody is charged with wounding of almost half of Maidan protesters. And because they admitted publicly, because these protesters testify again that they were shot from Hotel Ukraine and other Maidan controlled buildings, or that even Ukrainian government ballistic experts, in their examination, they pointed to snipers located in the Hotel Ukraine and other buildings. So this is another evidence. They claim that I am not expert in forensic, so I'm not forensic expert, so they deny that all this evidence, which is again common sense evidence. You cannot just shoot somebody who would be from the front if there are bullets from the back or from the side and from very steep direction. So you cannot shoot this bullet from the front from horizontal level, unless there would be some ricochet concern. But this is not systematic and so on. And this is another type of evidence.
Sorry for interrupting, because it reminds me of what you were talking about, because we actually spoke for about half an hour before we started to record, and we discussed the media coverage, because this is what you were talking about then. We should probably have hit record earlier, but yeah, that the media tends, it doesn't only leave information out and twists things, but I think we use the word propaganda as well, because this seems very much from my perspective, one of the most heavy propaganda conflicts there is. I mean, one isn't allowed to say it, because then you're accused of taking the other side, which is again is a key feature of propaganda. But I'm because I notice there's very little information people actually have, and the reason why is often you see that the word empathy is used as a to counteract it. So in other words, if you criticize, for example, the narrative, then it's suggested you don't perhaps have empathy for what's happening to the Ukrainians. And of course, I mean, who wouldn't have empathy? What's happening in Ukraine is completely gruesome. It's horrible. But what I find interesting is how they always use this narrative, as we discussed, to skew the media coverage. For example, with as you've talked about with the sniper events, that if you point out all the evidence, disproving the narrative which we are committed to, because this has to be a democratic revolution. We can't admit it was a coup. But also very basic things. I'm surprised. I'm located in Norway, and people seem completely oblivious to the idea that the Ukrainians up till 2014 didn't want to join NATO. It's seen as being a Russian propaganda, because we have the narrative that only thing Ukrainians were united in wanting to get away from Russia and to NATO. But every single poll from Ukraine's independence to 2014 always showed the same thing. Approximately 20% of Ukrainians want to join NATO. NATO recognized this in their own reports. They find it as a huge problem. What are we going to do? So, but still, this can't be said. Also, with the toppling, the coup. I mean, this idea that why would you oppose it if it's it was a democratic revolution? But again, the Ukrainians didn't want the coup. They did again. The BBC, all this Western media, they acknowledged there wasn't a democratic support for it, just as if there wasn't a democratic support for NATO. And it's just again, everything is framed in the West, I feel, as a we just want to support Ukraine. And again, I think this is a lot what propaganda does. It takes the best in human beings to do the worst, because of course I want to help Ukraine too. Like, who doesn't? You see them suffering, you want to help. But again, when we said help, we said let's help them with the anti-terrorist operation against Donbass. So again, 8 years of bombing the population in Donbass, and it's all of it always falls under helping Ukraine. And I think one of the most grievous aspects of helping Ukraine was, Zelensky's election. Like me and Alexander talked about this before, in 2019, the Ukrainians 73% voted for him. And if you watch his speeches, he was very clear. I mean, we shouldn't divide the country. Don't let the people in the East speak Russian. Let them have their culture. If we keep pushing this nationalist line, we're going to divide the country. But yet he was elected on this peace with Donbass, peace with Russia, implement Minsk. Yet once he was elected, you have all this pressure from the nationalists, also very indirectly from the United States, and he completely reverses after a while. And I've heard that this was a conspiracy theory. But if you go in the Ukrainian media, was it Kyiv Post, or I forgot the name of the newspaper? They covered it to such a great extent, how Dmitry Yarosh, to all these different political leaders threatening the life of Zelensky if he tries to push through his election promises. And we can't criticize it, because if we criticize how they flipped the will of the Ukrainian people, then you take the side of Russia. And now you're a Putinist. It's just I'm just wondering, is there another word for this propaganda? Because it just it seems yes, same where we are now. The key argument's always we have to send more weapons, like this videos of Ukrainians being dragged off the street to sent into the army. This is what we have to do. We have to continue more weapons, fight to the last Ukrainian. Otherwise, you're anti-Ukrainian. You're Putinist you have no empathy for Ukrainian if you don't want to send weapons. It's just it feels like empathy is always used to mobilize for war. It's never used to, let's make a compromise with the Russians, let's stop NATO expansion. Let's offer this to take this burden off the back of the Ukrainians. Let's have use this as bargaining card with the Russians to, give back some territory or get some concession. But it's always, empathy always means to throw the Ukrainians at the front line. It's just, I don't know. It feels like propaganda to me, though. That's my, but I'm not sure how you've seen it, Professor, since the toppling of Yanukovych. How have you seen the development from that to the Russian invasion? Because that was an 8-year, span. Did you research a lot of this area as well, now this time period as well, in terms of the rise of the nationalist? Not necessarily that they had a lot of support by the population, but nonetheless the power they accrued after removing Yanukovych. Because a lot of Western media covered this immediately after, recognizing the BBC as well. Many documentaries, articles saying the nationalists have really taken a lot of power now in the toppling of Yanukovych. But then it kind of fizzled out and disappeared. I'm not sure. Is this a focus of yours?
Yes, exactly. I research also Western media coverage of Ukraine and other post-communist countries. I also research far-right in Ukraine, and I research current war between Russia and Ukraine, and also kind of Western media coverage. So I can use only term which I can use is that this is like Orwellian tactic, basically, or strategy, to kind of by the media and by politicians, basically, to kind of misrepresent for their own self-interest, kind of what's going on in Ukraine, and also kind of just to to use it for their own benefits. And because I don't see any empathy towards Ukrainians, I see actually a lot of so this actually war and events which took place after Maidan kind of corroborate my studies of my academic studies in terms of representation of Ukrainians and policies. Western policies towards Ukraine has been very negative towards Ukraine and Ukrainians in particular, because I see only that the Ukrainians started from Maidan massacre and overthrow of Yanukovych. They are used by the Western governments and treated by Western media basically only as tools by the West to weaken Russia or to use against Russia. So this means the Western countries supported like violent overthrow of kind of relatively democratically elected government or semi-democratic government of Yanukovych by means of a false flag Maidan massacre and by assassination attempts, including by far-right, which is again would not be acceptable by any Western country in their own country. But they supported this. They supported civil war in Donbass, like use of military force in Donbass. They supported also basically kind of other actions like against Russian speakers or Russian minorities and so on, which would not be considered to be acceptable in any Western democracies. So this means the Western countries support. They not support Ukraine. They actually use Ukraine to advance their own geopolitical interests Specifically, Ukraine is now a proxy state, and since Maidan a proxy, kind of not a proxy state, a client state of the United States, and it's used. The only purpose that Ukraine and Ukrainians are used is to again weaken Russia, and I don't think this is any empathy because actually this means that Ukrainians are sacrificed for the sake of geopolitical interests and very few. I think there is no even discussion, for instance, that Ukraine is used as proxy war after Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was a real possibility of peace deal to be signed in about 1 month ago, not once, sorry, 1 year ago, at the end of March of 2022, when there was negotiation led by Israeli Prime Minister, former Israeli Prime Minister, who admitted recently in his interview that there was a very close possibility to agreement between Russia and Ukraine to end this war. But Western countries, in particular British and American administration, they blocked this agreement, and this was supported also by statement from Ukrainian newspaper, Finska Pravda, which is pro-Maidan newspaper, which reported in May of 2022 that there was also a very good chance for such agreement, and there was even negotiation of a meeting between a summit between Zelensky and Putin to finalize such a deal. But this deal was blocked by the West, specifically by British Prime Minister Johnson, who visited Kyiv and told Zelensky not to sign any peaceful deal with Putin, and that Putin needs to be punished, not negotiated with, and the Western governments, they told Zelensky they would not support such peace deal if he would sign on his own, because they would not provide any guarantees in case of such peace deal. And this is why, kind of for me, this is kind of a very tragic situation for Ukraine, because now Ukrainians are used and killed and die for the reasons which are again not justifiable by any democracy reasons and by any empathy. They basically they are done for basically cynically. They used kind of to achieve geopolitical goals, and which are not compatible with democracy, not compatible with human rights, not compatible with any other kind of sovereignty of Ukraine or agency of Ukraine, which they like to talk about. So because, as I mentioned, Ukraine, after Maidan massacre, there was evidence of regime change led by the US, and Ukraine became a client state, and basically based on the influence of the US on internal Ukrainian politics, and now Ukraine is continue to be used as a proxy with war with Russia, kind of in order to weaken Russia. Even so, Ukraine has no real possibility of defeating Russia militarily. So this is again, basically, this is kind of very damaging for Ukraine in the future, and this is why kind of I'm quite skeptical, and I don't regard anything kind of supportive of Ukraine, because I don't see any real support for Ukrainians. Actually, I see that they have been used basically to achieve such goals, and also it's necessary to say that Ukraine is not united as was presented by all this Western media and politicians, because I also did research about regional political divisions, which I mentioned. I published dissertation. I did my dissertation on this topic and published later this as a book, academic book, in which there was clear division between Western and central Ukraine and eastern and southern Ukraine, in particular Donbass and Crimea, the two regions which supported the separatists even before Maidan. Kind of became centers of Russian separatism afterwards, but there was also other regions which were kind of more oriented towards Russia. They did not want to join Russia, to be annexed by Russia, but they supported more friendly relations with Russia. They were populated by Russian speakers, in contrast to Western Ukraine, which I'm originally from central Ukraine, which is actually more Ukrainian speaking, and supported more NATO membership and European Union membership. And now basically people who were kind of still in Donbass and Crimea, they support joining Russia. So they actually, they are in this regard, they actually kind of, but their views again not represented. They are not considered to be Ukrainians, and even the fact of civil war in Ukraine, which took place in 2014 and still ongoing, they are still fighting, for instance, between separatists and separatist forces, and Ukrainian forces. Again, even if so, now Russia annexed these regions. So basically, this is totally denied by the media. It's not possible even to say that this is civil war. Even so, in my studies, all the evidence is overwhelming, and including majority of academic scholars who research this war, they classify this as a civil war with the Russian military interventions. But the fact is again denied or ignored by the media because this is inconvenient. So basically, this means that Ukrainians were killing Ukrainians and this started with Maidan. This started, which was major crime which taking place, and again, but now nobody cares about this. There is no justice, and again, and this is actually supported by Western governments, and I think even media, they don't care about this because they know evidence, but for them this is not important. For them, they basically follow their own governments. That's why they use this to justify such policies to what you can. That's why I'm quite I'm become, I think, quite skeptical and also kind of even disappointed by the degree to which politicians, Western politicians, can use Ukrainians basically and do not care that so many Ukrainians getting killed to achieve their own goals, geopolitical goals. And this is actually, I think, the manifestation of very negative view of Ukraine and Ukrainians during this war, because they are basically sacrificed just to contain Russia or to show that China, that basically that invasion would not be tolerated and so on. So, but this is, even so, there is no real possibility of defeating Russia militarily. So that's why all the talk about supporting Ukraine is actually not supporting Ukraine, but using Ukraine. So this is quite important because politicians and media, they are processing this and that, and this is also important to understand this, and this applies to other conflicts taking place as well.
I completely agree. I would add that I think that the Western powers run a risk that at some point, when the whole feeling about this comes through in Ukraine, there will be an awful lot of people in Ukraine who become very, very critical of the rest, look at their country, look at what was done to them, and start asking the question, really, who was to blame? And perhaps it was the West. And some of this anger that's at the moment focused on Russia might be transferred westwards. I've seen that happen in other places. I've seen that happen in Chechnya, for example. I've actually encountered people from Chechnya, and who fought the Russians and feel today that they were used. And they were very anti-Russian before, and now their attitudes have changed very radically. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it could happen. One of the things, could you just ask one question, Professor Kaczynowski? One thing I simply do not understand about this whole affair is that Maidan happened a year before an election was supposed to take place in Ukraine. Most people thought Yanukovych was going to lose. When he signed off on that agreement, on the 21st of February, some weeks after the protests, it looked even more likely he was going to lose. So why go through all the trouble of overthrowing him in this violent way? Was it because there were some concerns that, he might win? Or was it perhaps because you didn't want to tolerate anybody who might be in any way sympathetic to some kind of rapprochement with Russia? And that was, something that Yanukovych was associated with. And you wanted basically to eliminate anybody who had sort of alternative views. That's a bit of a loaded question, Professor Kaczynowski, but perhaps you could just briefly point at that, and then I will hold my peace.
Okay, I think there were two reasons for this. One reason that Maidan opposition, I think Western governments who knew what actually happened during the Maidan, and Maidan opposition leaders who actually were involved in this post-Black Maidan massacre, they were afraid that this that if Yanukovych will stay in power, this evidence of post-Black Maidan massacre and evidence of Maidan snipers become public, and would actually use to to diminish influence of Maidan opposition, and that they might actually lose elections. So there was such a possibility, a real possibility, if he would stay in power and have possibility to investigate, because there were like a lot of evidence. So this was a clear cut, and so it was not something again which required a lot of investigation. It was like there are videos of sniper shooting and so on, and even actually one of leaders of a group of Maidan snipers who actually publicly admitted in Ukrainian media that he led his group of Maidan self-defense group, which included snipers who shot Maidan protesters and police. He admitted basically, and members of his group in BBC interview and Ukrainian media interviews admitted shooting police. during the Maidan massacre, and they were later filming the Hotel Ukraina in a variety of videos, including shooting with Maidan protesters. So this leader of far-right link group of Maidan self-defense and group of Maidan snipers, he said in Ukrainian media that he actually was involved in pressuring, basically, or forcing members of Ukrainian parliament to vote for impeachment of Yanukovych. So, and specifically from Party of Regions and Communist Party. So they were forced by this kind of leader of one of the leaders from Maidan snipers specifically to remove Yanukovych, and this is just one evidence because he was presented basically as the one who made this speech asking Yanukovych to, or threatening Yanukovych with violence, and he was presented as hero by even Western media, by Ukrainian media, and in fact there is evidence that he and his group were actually involved in this massacre of the police and protesters, and this is why you have obviously self-interest not to allow any investigation and to restore Yanukovych to prevent such investigation. So there was self-interest in not to allow investigation of Maidan massacre because it would immediately reveal that this was not Yanukovych forces. It would have been clear that this was actually Maidan opposition and including far right, and this is why they do not want to allow this. Another reason I think was that even if Yanukovych would have lost elections after Maidan massacre, in such case, there was also real possibilities that he or another pro-Russian force or party would be able to win elections in the future. What happened after the Orange Revolution? Because after the Orange Revolution, when Yanukovych tried to falsify election, or Kuchma tried to falsify election results in favor of Yanukovych, so this led to mass protests and and election results were nullified. And President Yushchenko was elected as president of Ukraine, but Yanukovych managed to make comeback. He won next presidential elections, and he came to power during elections which were regarded as democratic elections. And this, I think, was kind of danger for Maidan opposition and to Western countries, because this meant that there was a real possibility that Yanukovych or any other pro-Russian party, maybe or relatively pro-Russian party, would win elections again, and they would lose elections. That Maidan opposition would lose elections, and this is why this would mean that Ukraine would not be used as a tool against Russia. It would titillate between pro-Western and pro-Russian in elections, because popular support was almost equally divided, and any situation could have swing support either from pro-Western or pro-Russian political forces and presidential candidates in Ukraine. And I think this was another reason why they supported such violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government by means of the false flag Maidan massacre, by this constitutional impeachment and by assassination attempts, which would this would not be acceptable by any Western countries. This is like what is January 6th event. So this is considered to be totally unacceptable. Far right in the West is totally regarded as totally beyond any even possibility to have any acceptance. But in Ukraine, far right was able to join security forces, Ukrainian government. They were able to join the military. They have their own unit like Azov regiment, now Azov brigade, even opening neo-Nazis, and this is like tolerated by the West. They have no problems. They were involved also in Odessa massacre and Maidan massacre. But again, there are no pressure from the West to do anything against far right, and I think because far right is very useful in this regard, again, because they are ideologically motivated, they rely on violence. This is why they are useful for geopolitical purposes, like similarly to what was with Al-Qaeda in Syria. But I think claims by Putin that this Ukraine is Nazi state or neo-Nazi state, again, also basically false, because Ukraine, Zelensky and his government are not Nazi or not neo-Nazi. But again, there is a real issue which is used by the West and by Russia specifically for their geopolitical reasons, and I think this is very difficult and very problematic in terms of future of Ukraine, because this is very dangerous and very damaging, as we can see right now.
I think it was an interesting comment you made that they had to make sure that Yanukovych or anyone like-minded wouldn't be able to come back, because I think that was the experience of the Orange Revolution in 2004. Because again, this was also then the West weighing in heavily in, as well as the Russians over that, into Ukraine's election in order to put in place pro-Western, anti-Russian president, which was Yushchenko. So again, a lot of popular support from Ukrainians, but I would say it was hijacked to a large extent by the NATO EU agenda as well, in terms of the main objective being that it ends up in our side, in our camp, if you will. So, but again, the Yushchenko experience was interesting because NATO, we got Yushchenko in place. His first ideas were, hey, we have to get into NATO, we have to get away from Russia. So all of the same ideas as before. But as we know, this didn't go down very well with the Ukrainians. I mean, they were able to get the promise of future NATO membership, but the Ukrainians didn't want to be part of this. There was, again, 17 to 20% who actually supported it. So I remember at the end of his presidency, there was this article in Time magazine or Newsweek. It had the title was "Yushchenko's star has fallen," and it said that he's now the most unpopular president in the world with 2.7. That's 2.7% approval rating, which makes Kim Jong-un and George Bush look like rock stars by comparison. So it was horrible. Like, they immensely unpopular. So they didn't like the policies. So I think that this was, and then what happened? Yanukovych took the election in 2010, and he's back. So I think that a coup can have a more permanent, because it has this revolutionary dynamic to it, which you uproot a lot of the existing structures. So, for example, after the coup, on the same day, the first legal proposal they advanced was removing the Russian language from as an official language. I mean, this was the first thing. So the idea, the de-Russification process, I guess, to make it permanently, to make the revolution permanently, which you might not be able to get an election. And you have the cultural repression as well of the at least the Ukrainians in the east. We saw a lot of the opposition parties, and especially the Party of Region and the Communist Party, being purged to some extent. The opposition leader Medvedchuk, I mean, thrown in jail because he was arrested. He was arrested, but not in jail. He was put in what is it called? House arrest, and again, this was before Russia invaded, because he became a more powerful opponent to Zelensky. He was more popular, and also the media. One shouldn't forget that Zelensky started shutting down all opposition media. You wouldn't be able to do this in a regular election, but this is that's why I think a coup can be more effective in terms of having more permanent changes. And of course, I think the economy is quite important, because as long as Ukraine's economic interest lies with Russia, they will find their way back together. But I thought it was interesting after the coup what happened to economic governance. First of all, you had the Americans, Hunter Biden becoming, taking on the board of Burisma, so essentially merging in with the Ukrainian energy industry. Also, the most I thought grotesque example was Natalie Yaresko. She was a U.S. citizen. She worked for the U.S. State Department. She was a former economic section chief of the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine. In other words, in the American Embassy for Ukraine, an American state official. And afterwards, she received. She took the job as the finance minister. Was it finance minister? Yeah, of Ukraine. And she got the citizenship on the same day, a Ukrainian citizenship, so she could take over. So you work in the American embassy to Ukraine, and then you take over as the finance minister of Ukraine. I mean, for me, it feels like a coup. Shifting the economic interests away from Russia. Again, economic disaster for Ukraine, but a permanent split. So I think this is a good, and not to support the coup, but this is an advantage of a coup, if you will, if you want to have more permanent changes. And obviously, the Russian reaction didn't help as well by taking back Crimea and supporting Donbass. I guess this also turned a lot of Ukrainians, of course, against Russia. So it's, I'm not sure if you agree, Alexander. If this is more.
No, I completely agree. I mean, bear in mind, I've experienced a coup myself. It happened in Greece in my childhood, and that is the purpose of a coup. A purpose of a coup, in part, obviously, is you overthrow a government that you might not be able to overthrow, but it's also partly intended to change the political landscape and the cultural landscape, to carry out a root and branch eradication. It certainly That was what was attempted unsuccessfully in Greece, but it's been pursued much more consistently in Ukraine. A root and branch eradication of forces within the society that you might see not just as potential dangers now, but as potential dangers later. And unfortunately, tragically, in the case of Ukraine, all of this happened within the context of a greater geopolitical struggle over which Ukrainians ultimately have no control. And going back to the comments that Professor Kachanovsky was making, of which Ukrainians are the victims. I mean, both of you gentlemen were talking about empathy for Ukraine. I mean, people who really care about Ukraine should care about what happened at Maidan. They should care about what happened after Maidan, what was done to Maidan, the way in which the whole situation of Ukraine has been pushed into this geopolitical conflict, which is destroying so many Ukrainians and destroying so much Ukrainian life. But that, in my opinion, that's exactly why I think there was the coup. You don't just want an election, because Yanukovych might lose the election, but then, as Professor Kachanovsky said, he might win again. Or if not him, maybe someone like Medvedchuk, or maybe someone else, somebody with different views. And you don't want that because you want a permanent change, because you need both to transform Ukraine internally, and you want, if you're involved in a geopolitical conflict, to secure Ukraine, to anchor Ukraine decisively within your system.
I think also, sorry, that part of the reason why the media has been so horrible is, I think, as Professor Kachanovsky pointed out, the evidence doesn't matter. You can put all the evidence in front, but the only thing I think matters is what does it signal? Are you giving legitimacy to NATO or to Russia? Because if you're saying something that undermines the narrative of NATO, then you're taking Russia's side, and now you're a Putinist, and you don't care about Ukraine. Like, this is always the narrative. Because I remember after Russia annexed Crimea, the argument was, I was at the barrel of a gun. It's like, well, I can agree. There's a huge problem with the legality of it. You can't, you need Kyiv's consent before you. Well, it's a complicated system with the parliament in Crimea, but nonetheless, it wasn't correct. I mean, all Western analysis or polls show the same thing, that there was a support for it. It doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that I would have to support it. But just if you state the fact, it's interpreted as an indication of support for the wrong side, if you will. And we have to pick the right trenches. And I remember when I think it was Putin who compared Crimea with Kosovo, and Obama went out and gave this speech that no, you can't compare it, because in Kosovo you had this, there was also a referendum with all this democratic oversight from the OSCE, and this was, international community was there, and then but there was never any referendum in Kosovo, nothing. Like, I asked people, when was the date for this referendum? It never happened, but not a single Western journalist picked up on this and said, well, actually there was never a referendum, but instead we just run with it. Because if you would point out Obama, there was no referendum, write an article about this, it will be interpreted as a statement of support for Russia. Now you're supporting their annexation of Crimea, and effectively you're a Russian stooge. So it's just, you're not allowed to say, like Professor Kachanovsky, you can have all the facts, for example, of what happened on Maidan in place, but all they hear is, oh, well, now you're just, this is what the Kremlin wants you to think. And
I entirely agree, but can I just make an observation? It wasn't always this way. I mean, I can go back in time. I can remember reading newspapers at the time of the war in Vietnam. I mean, not the early part, but the later part, 1970s, I was already reading newspapers. And there was much more criticism and analysis and debate about the facts, and a much more nuanced understanding of the war in Vietnam than there is about this one. I mean, you came repeatedly against, in every newspaper, you would find people who'd come back and say, look, it's not as straightforward. The other side does have its concerns. It does have its points. Let's try and move beyond those. Let's look at these facts. And somehow, somewhere, it's all just gone away. So we're now presented with what is basically a fairy tale of, heroic Ukraine, democratic Ukraine, Ukraine that's 100% united and always has been wanting to join the West, and being attacked by this giant Russian bear. And of course, what happened in Maidan, in my experience today, most people in the West know absolutely nothing about Maidan at all. They don't even know that there were protests then. I mean, they would have known at the time, but that was, 8 years ago? The memory of that's faded. We don't talk about it. We certainly don't talk about the events that Professor Kachanovsky talked about. Ukraine has always been this pure democratic state. And that's why we must support it. And if you don't do that, then, of course, as you correctly said, you're a pro-Putin stooge. And that wasn't how it was. And it shows, this is what I feel, how this geopolitical struggle, which has made Ukraine its victim, is changing our societies, our own Western societies, because I live in Britain, and it's changing our societies in a way that is very much to their detriment too.
Yes, I think I can agree. And for me, this is, I think, a very negative development, because I see that Western countries becoming, in this case, as more like Ukraine, because there were exactly similar kind of arguments when, for instance, I researched the involvement of the UN and UPA in mass murder of Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians during World War II and after World War II, which was documented. This is based on evidence, documents, testimonies, again, overwhelming evidence, even admissions by UN and UPA leaders, and German documents about their collaboration with Nazi Germany and so on. All the evidence was available, but if you write something, like when I wrote something or tried to publish this in Ukrainian media, kind of Ukrainska Pravda newspapers, they invited me, but then they could not publish my research because this ran against their kind of narrative, which presented basically this UN and UPA organizations as fighters for Ukrainian independence, again, and denied any collaboration with Nazi Germany or justify them for some other reasons and so on. And so if you try to present this, this was immediately, you have responded, this was like Soviet propaganda, or kind of, because this is equivalent to Soviet, because Soviet Union also kind of presented them as Nazi kind of collaborators and so on. So basically, evidence did not matter at all. The only what is important is what kind of political considerations, and I think this is a very kind of very negative development, because I mentioned in my article, in my papers, which I think the article which I mentioned would be published soon in a peer-reviewed journal, and there is a kind of at the beginning of the article there is a quote from John Adams, who was one of the leaders of American Revolution and fight for independence of U.S. and also became United States president. And before he became president of the United States, he was a lawyer who led a defense of the British soldiers during the Boston massacre trial in Boston. So this was famous massacre which took place when pro-independence, from pro-American independence residents of Boston had confrontation with British soldiers, and British soldiers killed local residents, Boston residents, who supported basically who opposed against the British government, British monarchy, and supported the independence basically of the United States. And this, again, immediately in the U.S. media, there was a kind of blame for British soldiers that they massacred without any provocation, without any reason, and so on. And this John Adams, actually one of the leaders of for independence movement in the U.S., and specifically stated that during the Boston massacre trial, he became a lawyer for the British forces, for British soldiers who were accused of this massacre in Boston. And he said in his famous quote, which I quote also in my paper, that facts are kind of facts need to be accepted basically no matter what our passions, not what kind of our preferences. We need to rely on facts no matter what they say, and this is kind of no matter what kind of implications they mean. And he specifically defended British soldiers, saying that they were provoked basically by local residents of Boston who supported independence, by basically trying to kind of to provoke them into shooting, and this was not planned and so on. And British soldiers were actually acquitted by the trial as a result of the trial. And this happened I think at the end of the end of 18th century. So this was then kind of argument which was considered to be normal, that you can just rely on evidence, not on politics. Even so, this was very damaging to this myth that the Boston Massacre was conducted basically by British forces who killed protesters. They did not deny this. They killed these protesters who supported U.S. independence, but they were acquitted basically because of evidence said that this was not just an unprovoked massacre. There was other kind of reasons, and this is just one example. And now, basically, you try to do similar arguments, and now they use all this kind of very primitive arguments that there is only one basically kind of two ways to say something, which is and evidence basically needs to be based only on political narrative, and evidence does not matter. And for me, this is, I think, very dangerous development and very negative development, because kind of what would this mean if, for instance, doctors would start to give their diagnosis and treatment based on politics, not based on evidence, not based on medical tests, but based on political considerations, based on country of origin, based on political party affiliation. This would be totally kind of unprofessional, and the same applies to academics. So again, I'm as academic as actually Ukrainian also. Kind of for me, this is very important to rely on facts and not on any kind of politics. And for me, it does not matter what they say, because I know that they are kind of, my arguments are very solid. They are based on evidence, which nobody can actually disprove. Because again, it's very easy to disprove my arguments. Just do research, present evidence, and present such testimonies, present similar evidence, and so on. But nobody can do this. They only can rely on this kind of false political arguments, trying to kind of imply that this is like something political, motivated or linked, and so on. Even so, there is no evidence at all. But this is kind of their strategy, or they just making claims, again, kind of trying to deny this or ignore this. This is another way, basically trying to censor this, as happened with my article, which was accepted for peer-reviewed journal with minor revisions and then rejected by another editor because they do not like political implications. And even academia now became the place when, again, it's become very difficult to do research and basically to do what a scholar is supposed to do, because this is like task of scholars not to just repeat politician narratives or media narratives, but to rely on evidence, and no matter what it says. And this is, I think, very important. And I can say that just one example, I testified as an expert witness in the United States court cases, in immigration cases, and specifically about Maidan, my research about Maidan massacre, and my evidence was used during these trials by judges, and most of testimonies were accepted as evidence without. Again, as a witness, and judges including in one case which was directly related to Maidan massacre, judges issued decisions based on my evidence. They used my evidence, academic studies, and they accepted this, and they used in one case, a lawyer said that the judge cited all my evidence all the way in her decision to basically, and even in another case which was considered by a lawyer who told me that this case was regarded as basically totally unlikely to be won. It was actually won after I presented again as an expert witness and testified based on my research. And this is again under oath. So this is again and without any kind of any other motivations. And I'm, again, as I mentioned, and this is, I think, very important for Ukraine, because truth is very important, and I think truth became casualty of the war between Russia and Ukraine after Russian invasion, even to much greater extent than before. But I think in any case, in any future, this will be still a very important issue. So even so, the tactic of suppression and censorship, or making all this false claims again, and all this ad hominem attacks and so on, this can have some temporary effect in the long run. I think this is very important to know and understand what happened, and I think the truth would prevail, and people would have to actually admit what happened, and I think the people who were responsible would still face justice in any kind of, even if it might be delayed, or even if it might be just symbolic justice, it would be still, I think, clear what happened and why it happened, what kind of terrible consequences for Ukraine this Maidan massacre had. And again, but this obviously does not justify actions by Russia, because again, Russia or make Russian actions legal in case of annexation of Crimea, which was supported by local residents, majority of them, but again, which not be according to the law, and also does not justify Russian invasion. But I can say also that this was very clear, because that Ukraine was like basically a powder cake, which was there was a very strong possibility of conflict and breakup of Ukraine because before Maidan, and I wrote in my dissertation, published in my book, about which was called Cleft Countries, which examined regional divisions and conflicts in Ukraine and Moldova, in particular separatism in Donbass, in Crimea, and in Transnistria region, in the Berguzia region of Moldova. So I compared why there was conflict in Moldova, secession and breakup of Moldova after Russian separatist region of Transnistria seceded, and why there was no such conflict and secession of Crimea and Donbass, even so these regions were also supporting separatists and wanted to join Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And my finding was that this happened because, to a large extent, because of politicians. So politicians in Ukraine at the time, and Western governments and Russian governments, they did not support such conflict. Basically, they did not support such secession in Ukraine, and this enabled Ukraine to remain peaceful until this changed during Maidan. So Maidan was very crucial in this regard, because Maidan politicians, they started to rely on violence, in particular Maidan massacre and assassination attempts, and this was supported by Western governments. And afterwards, Russia started to support separatists in Donbass, and and this led to kind of changes of policy. And now basically Ukraine is de facto broken up, and there is again for Ukraine. In any case, I don't see any possibilities that Ukraine would be able to take back control over Donbass or Crimea. So they're basically lost now for the future and after Russian annexation. So I think this is the question is only what kind of damage of Ukraine and how Ukraine would be able to survive and end this war, because conflict is likely to continue with very negative consequences, and with little possibility, basically close to zero possibility of Ukraine being able to defeat Russia and kind of militarily, because Russia has military advantage, even with support kind of from the West, which is given to Ukrainian both military, financial, and so on. And I think in this regard, I think this is a big tragedy, because truth about Maidan massacre is directly relevant to conflict as well, because it shows that how easy it basically it's to fool people or to kind of mislead them by omitting some evidence, by kind of using some evidence like videos, which are shown as basically the videos which were filmed and shown on Western television or many other Ukrainian television, showing the Belgorod police shooting and protesters being killed. But this was I noticed this even at the start of Maidan massacre, that these videos were edited. Basically, you have in one videos you have basically police shooting, and in other videos you have protesters killed. So these two events were presented basically as blaming police shooting into protesters and protesters killed. But when I examined all the videos of Maidan massacre, synchronize them according to time frame and according to specific sound and announcement from Maidan stage, they are synchronized. In my studies, it becomes immediately clear that times of police shooting did not coincide with times of protesters being killed. So when police were shooting, they were shooting into ground. You can see like a bullet hitting ground, or they were shooting in the walls, Hotel Ukraina, location of snipers, or they were shooting in front of protesters, kind of to stop their advance, or into trees, or kind of or poles, electric poles, and so on. There is no evidence that they were shooting actually in protesters, and because the time and the action of shooting by Belgorod police do not coincide with specific times and the actions where protesters were killed. And this is like all this evidence is supported by other kind of synchronized videos, which are also included by this C2 company and the Ukrainian group. So it's now clear, even videos which are presented as main argument, as main evidence that the protesters were killed by police, actually show opposite. But again, this is never reported. This is, I think, kind of a big issue and just big example how easy it's basically to mislead people just using such a kind of primitive, basically kind of censorship and distortion and fake news in the case of Maidan massacre. But it has very profound consequences for understanding other conflicts, including current war between Russia and Ukraine.
I thought it was interesting you mentioned Moldova before, because it has a lot of similarities to what happened in Ukraine. Because you have the Transnistria or Pridnestrovye region, which broke loose, and Russia attempted to reach an agreement there in 2006. I mean, and the key agreement was, Transnistria had to give up a lot of its desires to have a full, comparative with equality with the rest of Moldova, because they're much smaller. But anyways, long story short, they ended up with a compromise in which Transnistria they would unify. And they would then they wouldn't have so much influence, Transnistria, in unified Moldova. However, they would have autonomy to the extent that they could block NATO membership, and this was the main thing the Russia wanted, because they want an end to NATO expanding on its borders. So they said, okay, this is what we get. We get to block at least NATO. I'm not sure if it would include the EU as well. And then they agreed. The Moldovan side and Transnistria, the Moldovan president boarding a flight, ready to go sign the paper, and would you know, they get a call from the EU and the Americans saying, listen, do not sign this. It's unacceptable. Like, we have a future path. It's NATO. This NATO is coming. So do not sign this agreement. And it was thrown out. And because they couldn't afford to anger both the EU and the Americans. But this was essentially the West stepping in, actually preventing a peace which was agreed upon. And this is, again, I feel like this, sometimes I feel a little bit of a deja vu when I see in Ukraine. And also, right to what you said about academia and truth, because that's what academia is supposed to be. It's supposed to be pursuit of truth. But it's very difficult, because being asked to ignore facts in the name of supporting Ukraine. But that's why I also thought one of your articles were quite interesting, because it was said, if falsehood about the Ukrainian conflict is standing in the way of peaceful resolution. You wrote, I think, about 2 years ago, and but again, it goes contrary to the narrative, because you have to support the narrative if you want to help Ukraine. But again, drawing on the Moldovan analogy again, or comparison, it just like, it just looks like we did the same, but we don't report on it. You touched on it a bit before with Minsk, for example. You had both the German chancellor and the French president who signed the Minsk agreement coming out saying, we didn't intend to implement it. It was meant to be a peace agreement. We just wanted to buy time to arm Ukraine. This is quite an extraordinary statement, because every Western major leader has said there's no peaceful alternative to Minsk. And yet we're not really planning Minsk. Instead, we're arming. For me, it's like, how else would you sabotage a peace? And we went to the UN and signed this Minsk agreement. It was international law. So our side, or NATO, if you will, also breaking international law. But if you read the papers across Europe now, they said, the Russians weren't following Minsk, the Ukrainians were. I mean, but Russia's not mentioned in the Minsk agreement. It wasn't an agreement with Russia. It was, Kiev and Donbass. It's not mentioned, and yet we're arguing that the Russians didn't follow it. It's just, and again, it's not a statement of support for Russia. It's just recognizing the fact. Look, in Minsk II agreement, Russia does not appear, because it was an agreement between Kiev and Donbass. It doesn't mean that Russia's not a participant in the conflict, but again, you're not allowed to state the basic facts. And also, as Professor Kachanovsky pointed out before, the sabotage of the peace agreements after Russia invaded. For me, why is this not front page in the media? It's just quite extraordinary. I mean, the Israeli prime minister, who tried to negotiate, on record sitting on a podcast saying, yes, the West wanted to block it. And then the interviewer asks him, what, the West blocked it? Yes, they blocked it. Okay, well, I was accused of spreading falsehood when I cited this in an article. And the Turkish foreign minister as well, coming out very clearly, the West wasn't ready for peace. They wanted to fight Russia with Ukrainians. And if you criticize this or point it out, you're not supporting Ukraine. It's just again, it's said to be a conspiracy, but Boris Johnson, he wrote op-eds. He went giving speeches saying we don't want a bad peace in Ukraine. And then the Ukrainian media, the American media, they are confirming, yeah, Boris Johnson, he told them, that do not sign this agreement. We're not going to support it. Instead, we'll give you weapons if you will fight. And I think the German general, Harald Kuyat, he was as well. He said the same thing. He was on NATO's Supreme Council or whatever it was, saying the same thing. The British and Americans sabotaged this because they wanted to fight Russia with Ukrainians. Again, my point isn't to whitewash Russia's culpability and responsibility in this horror show playing out in Ukraine, but this push to always whitewash NATO to make it sound like we have pushed peace when we sabotaged it at every possible opportunity. It's just so strange to me that this fits in the wider narrative of we care about Ukrainians, because for me all of this is just one long evidence of using Ukrainians as an instrument, as a tool. And that's why I also sorry, I went on for a bit too long. That's why I also said to Alexander, like I liked what you said, that the Ukrainians might wake up one day and realize that they've been used, or as we already said, Professor Kachanovsky, because we refer to the Chechens, but certainly the Kurds would also feel the same way. How many times have we said, "Oh, we care about the Kurds, we're going to help them to the extent we can use them against someone, against Iraq, against Syria," and as soon as they used up their utility, they're thrown away. I think it's cynical, and I don't know. For me, I'm just a bit appalled. This is always being done in the name of empathy and caring. So. Anyway, there wasn't a question at the end there. just a running comment.
Yes, if I can add, I agree with Minsk Poland was an important comparison with other conflicts, because it was very clear that, like in case of Moldova, secession of Transnistria Republic, that Russia they supported militarily by using their military, the army which was deployed in Transnistria to support secession of this region from Moldova, and the same could have happened in Ukraine, because and also that in case of Georgia, when Georgia Saakashvili tried to take back South Ossetia by force in August of 2008. This Russia also intervened in this case. So this was very clear that Russia would again intervene in case of a conflict in Ukraine, and they did this after by annexing Crimea. After this Maidan massacre, and also they took also started to support separatists, first indirectly and then by direct military interventions in August of 2014 and in winter 2015, and finally there was invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and I think this is very important. But I think that Minsk agreement provided opportunity for Ukraine and for Western. For Russia to resolve this conflict peacefully. It was a real possibility, similarly to what was peace deal. Similar peace deal was offered in Transnistria, which you mentioned, like de facto autonomy, but basically which would mean de facto not federal state, but the confederation, because autonomy would be very kind of large autonomy, like which would influence even foreign policy. So this was de facto confederation system, but this could have prevented kind of escalation of the conflict into war between Ukraine and Russia. And also, in case of European Union membership, this was a NATO membership. I wrote about this as well in my studies, and I said that this was possible to prevent such a war and avoid such a war if Ukraine kind of agreed to be in a neutral country, not to join NATO, because NATO membership was not likely in any case, because Western countries basically they do not want to sacrifice their own their own people. Military forces to fight Russia in Ukraine, because there was real danger of being involved in this, so they would not accept Ukraine into this in NATO for this reason. But I think if they cared about Ukraine and Ukrainians, it was very easy to to do this by offering Ukraine prospect of European Union membership. If Ukraine would fulfill all the conditions like democracy and like corruption and so on, and rule of law, which would provided benefit, which would be very beneficial for Ukraine, and could also have been able to solve and prevent breakup of Ukraine, because EU supported a membership of all countries in Balkans and former Yugoslavia, including Kosovo and Albania. but they refused to provide such a prospect for European Union membership for Ukraine. And I wrote about this in op-eds going back to more than 20 years, that the only kind of possibility for Ukraine to avoid to become like a Western democracy and to avoid a breakup, similar to Moldova, was basically to kind of to join the European Union or to become to have prospect of European Union membership, which would be incentive to resolve conflict peacefully and not to have a democratic policy, to respect for minorities and so on, and the rule of law. But I think in this case, the Western countries decided to use Ukraine instead as a proxy against Russia and not to treat as an equal country, which would be worth basically joining as a kind of as member of European Union. And I think in this case, this is a kind of very negative policy in this regard, and even so, it's justified by all this kind of idealistic kind of support for Ukraine, but in practice, this is actually using Ukraine for their own geopolitical goals. And I think this is very dangerous and very problematic. And for this reason, also media is not a reliable source. And especially also Western politicians are also not very reliable because, according to my research, I did content analysis of all media coverage, Western media coverage, in particular U.S. media coverage of post-communist countries, and it's very very easy to see that basically this coverage did not follow like facts even before this war, before Russian invasion of Ukraine. Basically, Ukraine was coverage of Ukraine and many other post-Soviet and post-communist countries was based on basically what is called indexing theory of political communication, when media basically represents or just follows narrative of their own political elite, basically government and opposition. In this regard, so basically, Western media now follows Western governments in covering Ukraine, war in Ukraine, and not what facts on the ground. The same applies to Maidan massacre. So, because there is no debate in the West, no political debate in the West about Maidan massacre, so Western media does not do any debate about this kind of, and do not it basically ignores evidence which is kind of which evidence and beyond any reasonable doubt showed this was false flag massacre, is involvement of right and Maidan opposition, oligarchical opposition, but they don't do this because there is no debate in the Western political system, and the same applies to current war between Russia and Ukraine. There is also almost no debate among Western governments or politicians, including especially European Union. They just kind of accepted U.S. policy in this regard, and the same applies to even many opposition parties. They united. So there is, I think, another issue that the politicians basically kind of, act now without kind of. There is no debate among Western politicians in this case about the kind of major political parties or major politicians, and this I think very dangerous development as well, because there is no possibility that media would take debates, because if there was a discussion in Western parliaments, for instance, or Western different political parties have debates about this issue, raise questions about Maidan massacre, then there was possibility that this would again media would pay attention, but because there is no such debate, in such case there is also no media coverage, which also explains basically why we get in such kind of a narrative, which is basically a politically motivated narrative, which has little to do with reality, but is used to kind of also a lot of people just take this narrative at face value, and they do not know about facts and such developments.
I thought it was interesting what you said about the West doesn't want to have its own body bags, because for me it almost sounded like a direct quote from an article by George Soros. I'm not sure if you've seen it. In 1993, he wrote an article in favor of NATO expanding and setting up partnerships with Eastern European countries. And in his words, because NATO has all the military power, but the West, we don't want to have our sons and daughters coming home in body bags. But the Eastern Europeans don't, in this again, not my word, just to make it clear, in his words, the Eastern Europeans, they don't really care that much, so they don't mind having a huge amount of body bags. So the argument was this is a good way for NATO to fight. We'll provide the weapons and we'll fight with the Eastern Ukrainians ending up because they can accept the amount of body bags. Now, obviously, George Soros is not the official spokesperson of NATO. I'm not is suggesting this, but it is a very strange. If you look at the media, the narrative, and our politicians, the way they're speaking about the casualness of sending Ukrainians to the front and dying for, it's just it's very strange that we would not talk in this way if it was our own. If with tens of thousands of our young men were being sent to be slaughtered on the front, we would talk about finding a compromise. We would talk about negotiations. We wouldn't be so casual about this. I think so. There is I think something. Somewhat exploitative behind this whole thing. And I'm thinking especially about all these videos now appearing. It was even covered by Radio Free Europe of this young Ukrainian men walking on the street being dragged into cars. This was part of the recruitment process. So this is recognized. It's not from Russian media, it's from Western media, not just Western media, but Radio Free Europe, which is pretty much American propaganda, channel, and still recognizing that this is a problem, and that these videos are going around, people being dragged out of their houses and off the street, and we were casual about it. We would never accept this if this was our own people, if this was ours. I just it's very I just picked up on the on that comment. It sounded very much like George Soros for a second. That's my point.
Yes, I agree because I think I did not expect that the Western policy would be kind of to such extent openly using Ukraine proxy with the war with Russia, because it's very damaging to Ukraine without any prospect of real prospect, basically, that Ukraine would win this war. And this is like a gamble. Basically, I use analogy of somebody kind of being encouraged to gamble their own, all their wealth and all their kind of money savings and so on, life savings in a casino, basically, because they can win. They have chance to win something like blackjack or some kind of all this big reward. Even so, statistically, there is no real possibility. Probability of doing this is very small. Basically, this is like, and this would be considered to be totally unacceptable in the West to do this, because and this is publicly also they publicly do not admit this by privately. This was reported in the media that the Western governments recognize, specifically U.S. government recognize there is no real possibility that Ukraine would be able to take back Crimea or even control Donbass. But they encourage in any way to do this, and I think this is why it's very negative and very dangerous in this case. Basically, using Ukrainians as a kind of to achieve such goals and preventing any discussion, rational discussion, by trying to using such arguments which have nothing to do with democratic system and liberal democracy and actually freedom of the media. So this is also very negative development, which have very significant repercussions also inside countries, Western democracies, because this undermines kind of foundations of democracies that you have, like freedom of speech, freedom of expression. There is a kind of opposition and minority rights and so on. And I think this is a big tragedy for Ukraine, because Ukraine would likely to suffer consequences of this war for a very long time. And I think if the war would end, then Ukraine might also suffer similar situation what happened with Afghanistan, when they also justify this basically supporting human rights, democracy in Afghanistan, and women's rights, and so on. And now, after the end of the war there, U.S. kind of withdrawal of U.S. and other Western forces, there is no basically discussion in the media. It's totally forgotten country. I think the same might happen with Libya. Also Libya, there was concern about human rights and so on under Gaddafi, and then suddenly totally there is even greater conflict, civil war, and much greater violence, de facto breakup of Libya. But again, there is nothing, almost no concern with the same politicians who were saying they care about Libyan people or Afghan people or Iraqi people. So I think in practice, this is just kind of propaganda. This is just tactic, and this is for me this is just that's why because I study conflicts and I research conflicts, I also teach conflicts in different countries. So for me, this is like so war in Ukraine is nothing new, because you can compare to what happened before, and Western policy in this regard also, I think, very crucial issue, which is often ignored because people just assume that just rhetoric by politicians, they take this at face value, especially since mainstream media just report this as a truth and not present any kind of factual evidence, or just do this very selectively in order to advance their narrative and arguments specifically to support this war, because for geopolitical reasons, not because of any kind of ideas like democracy or freedom or or sovereignty. I think they don't care about these issues, but they care about basically using Ukraine and Ukrainians to achieve such goals. And again, I have saying this as academic research because this is what part of my studies, which I presented in American political science situation, which I'm going to publish now in academic venues, in peer-reviewed journals, in also in books about this conflict. I write in a book on this conflict, kind of about this war and origins of this conflict, and I write a book about Maidan massacre. So this is this is nothing kind of. No, this is actually based on my academic research, based on the evidence. So this is not nothing kind of based on just some kind of political views or something. Because again, I have kind of no political motivation to that. I'm just this is for me. This is like professional task and professional duty, especially very important in this climate to say what actually I found, give the evidence, and because the consequences of this war and the conflict in Ukraine, which is already escalated and can escalate further, is can be very damaging because this can be the possibility of this conflict becoming nuclear war, which I think could become a real possibility if again
Can I just point out again that because it's a very important point that Professor Kachanovsky made, it isn't just in Ukraine that his evidence has been cited or evidence that he cites has been used in court. Professor Kachanovsky has been an expert in contested court proceedings, and his evidence was accepted in court. So it has achieved acceptance at that most rigorous level by people, judges, who are supposed to examine evidence. And I completely agree. By the way, I just wanted to mention a fact, gentlemen, about how the situation has deteriorated in terms of public debate in Britain. About 3 weeks ago, I attended a conference, a meeting, a public protest, if you like, which was brought together by people who were opposed to British policy and Western policy in Ukraine. And the venues, there was an enormous problem finding venues because the venues that agreed to host this event were repeatedly threatened. And some of those threats apparently extended to threats of violence. And from what I understand, the British police refused to investigate them, even though threats of violence are a crime. Now, I have attended protests many times in Britain over a variety of issues. I've never known that to happen before in Britain. Eventually, the protest was held on the premises of a diplomatic mission. In other words, because it was protected by a diplomatic mission, not from Russia, by the way, from a Latin American country. That was the only venue that could be found. But this, in Britain, in London, where we've had a history of peaceful protests going all the way back to, again, the 1800s, I mean, is a shocking development. And it shows the extent to which these cynical practices, using East Europeans as cannon fodder in NATO wars, using Ukraine as a chess piece in a geopolitical conflict, constructing our narratives around that. Because one of the good things to say is that I think if people in the West knew what our governments had been up to, they would not be supporting this situation in Ukraine. They would certainly support peace there. Well, look at the damage it's doing. And it's, as I said, undermining our democracies, just as it's destroying Ukraine.
Well, I think it's good, as well to look at previous conflicts to see the direction this is going. Because, as you both mentioned, Afghanistan. This was, whenever we mobilize for war, it's always in the name of love and care. So, when, for example, there was a drop off in support for the Afghanistan war in Afghanistan, they found out that the Europeans are quite sympathetic about the women's rights. So suddenly they rebranded it as, Afghanistan, we're there for the women, we have to help them. And, so again, it's all about help and care. And there's poor, people who just want freedom. And then, to push the war. But then once it failed, it didn't work. Well, what happened? Well, two things. One, freeze all their money. So now you're having a humanitarian crisis there. so this is how much you cared. And the second is you forget about it. And this is like, how will we live with it? Well, one day we just turn off the TV. The media don't report it anymore. And I think that could happen now with Ukraine as well. If Ukraine begins to collapse, NATO, well, we're going to lose. I think the way we deal with it, as from Bosnia to Afghanistan, we forget about it. We leave it there, and then it's just another victim on the road. So, anyways, I was just going to say, I think we've gone off for well over 2 hours. So, shall we wrap this up?
Well, again, can I just say a wonderful conversation, and my great apologies once more for joining it late. But I think we've learned a huge amount today, and I think anybody who wants to know about the history of Ukraine and where things went wrong owes Professor Kachanovsky an enormous debt. And I'm going to say this, Professor Kachanovsky, they may be trying to keep your work from getting the attention that it deserves, but it is there, and one day it will get that attention. There's that expression in Britain, the truth will out, and the truth will one day out about Maidan, and when it does, it'll be to you that people will go.
Yeah, again, thank you. This is was a very interesting, very useful, very important topic to discuss. And I think thank you for your comments and invitation. I enjoy talking to you. And this is, I think, a very good venue that now possibility to discuss such issues and such topics, because it's very important not only to understand this conflict, but also they are very important to Ukrainians and to origins of Ukraine to this conflict, and how to peacefully resolve this conflict and end this war, because and also to have justice in this case of mass murder, which is I think would still influence Ukrainian politics and would hold for a very long time because of enormous consequences which it had already. So I think this is a very crucial issue, and thank you for such opportunity. This was a very nice opportunity, and I enjoyed talking to you, and again, very good questions. So thank you.
Yeah, let me also finish off by thanking you. So I've been reading your research for a while, and seen you. So it's it was a good, it was a great to be able to have you on. So thanks a lot, Professor Kachanovsky, and yes, thanks for the people who have been watching. Bye.
Yes. Thank you for the invitation. Bye.